He was just 9 years old when they gave him the crown. By the time he died, England had become a nightmare. Edward VI wasn't just a boy king, he was a fanatic, a tyrant in miniature. And his death? It was so horrific, even Henry VIII might have flinched. Edward VI, the boy who ascended the throne at just 9 years old, would evolve from an apparently innocent child into one of England's most unyielding rulers, before meeting an end so grotesque it would forever haunt the Tudor dynasty. This is not merely the tale of a sickly youth's premature death. It is a lesson in how absolute authority corrupts completely, even in the grasp of a child. What you are about to learn of Edward's last days will challenge everything you believed about the Tudor legacy. Please don't forget to subscribe. This story will shock you. In 1537, Henry VIII finally obtained what he had longed for, a legitimate male successor. Edward's birth was celebrated throughout England as the solution to decades of dynastic instability. But this joy came at a heavy price. His mother, Jane Seymour, died merely 12 days after delivering him, leaving the infant heir without a mother and making him all the more precious to his increasingly suspicious father. From his earliest moments, Edward was treated not as a mere child but as England's salvation, guarded and constantly reminded of his divine destiny. This separation from the ordinary experiences of childhood would become the first step in shaping a tyrant. Unlike his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom had endured their father's wrath and rejection, Edward knew only praise and adoration. Henry VIII, perhaps burdened by guilt over his treatment of his daughters, lavished his son with attention and affection that bordered on reverence. The young heir received the best tutors money could secure, yet these were no ordinary educators. They were fervent Protestant theologians selected deliberately to fashion Edward into the ideal Protestant ruler. From the age of 6, Edward studied not only Latin and Greek, but also detailed theological works condemning Catholicism and affirming the divine right of Protestant monarchs to rule with absolute authority. The schooling Henry VIII arranged for his son was less education than it was ideological conditioning. Edward's chief tutor, John Chake, though a gifted scholar, was also a religious zealot who filled the boy's mind with visions of England as a new Jerusalem, cleansed of Catholic corruption. Every subject, be it history, philosophy, or the art of governance, was filtered through the prism of Protestant supremacy and monarchical absolutism. By the age of 8, Edward could deliver complex theological arguments for why Catholics merited execution and why opposing his future reign was equivalent to defying God himself. What rendered Edward's upbringing especially perilous was its blend of advanced intellectual training and utter emotional isolation. Though capable of debating theology with university scholars, he had never played with other children or formed normal friendships. His only companions were adults who treated him with constant deference, producing a boy who could grasp intricate political theories but possessed no sense of empathy or appreciation for the sanctity of human life. This toxic fusion of sharp intelligence and emotional deprivation would shape every facet of his reign. By the autumn of 1547, England was in the hands of a 9-year-old raised to believe he was God's chosen instrument on earth. Edward VI succeeded to the throne upon the death of his father Henry VIII, inheriting not only a crown but a kingdom fractured by religious turmoil. The boy king had been molded by the most extreme Protestant educators his father could assemble, men who filled his mind with visions of spiritual purity and unrestrained authority. Unlike his elder sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had felt their father's wrath directly, Edward had been protected, praised and assured from birth that he was destined for greatness. This marriage of divine entitlement and childish petulance would ultimately prove lethal for thousands. The England Edward inherited was a nation primed for religious explosion. His father had severed ties with Rome and founded the Church of England, yet the realm remained deeply fractured. Catholics, moderate Protestants and radical reformers each vying for dominance. Edward's Regency Council, headed by his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, at first appeared to favour a more balanced governance. However, the boy king quickly revealed he harboured his own firm vision for how the kingdom should be directed. From his earliest council sessions, Edward displayed a troubling blend of childish petulance and icy calculation, interrupting seasoned advisors to deliver lectures on Protestant theology. What astonished contemporary witnesses was how rapidly the 9-year-old began to assert himself. Within mere weeks of his coronation, he was personally examining death sentences and displaying a disquieting eagerness for the execution of those he branded heretics. Surviving court records from this era depict a child who approached matters of life and death as if they were scholarly debates, calmly weighing theological rationales for punishments with the same detachment he might apply to passing a Latin passage. Witnesses recounted that Edward would sometimes smile as he signed death warrants, seemingly pleased with his own ingenuity in uncovering scriptural support for each execution. His earliest months as ruler were defined by what courtiers privately dubbed religious tantrums, violent outbursts whenever anyone hinted at moderation in faith policy. So thoroughly had he absorbed his tutor's teachings that he truly believed any concession to Catholic practices constituted a personal betrayal of Christ himself. When one advisor proposed allowing certain Catholic nobles to maintain private worship, Edward reportedly hurled his inkwell at the man, shouting that God would punish England for such weakness. At first these episodes were dismissed as the whims of a child, yet they in fact signaled the rise of a dangerously committed religious zealot. Most unsettling was Edward's utter absence of normal childhood pastimes. While other 9-year-olds amused themselves with games, he devoted his free hours to reading grim accounts of the Spanish Inquisition and compiling meticulous notes on methods of interrogation. Servants claimed to have found drawings in his chambers depicting various torture devices, annotated with the young king's own assessments of their effectiveness in extracting confessions from those deemed heretics. The child, who ought to have been learning to ride horses instead, spent his time studying the most effective ways to break human bodies and spirits in service of his Protestant ideals. Edward's true danger lay in the combination of religious fanaticism and royal authority. While his advisors maneuvered and plotted around him, the boy king absorbed every teaching on the divine right of kings with unnerving zeal. He kept exhaustive journals of his reign, which reveal a child taking pleasure in accounts of executions, religious persecutions, and the misery of those he considered heretics. By the age of 10, Edward was personally crafting sermons that were read in churches throughout England, sermons demanding the total eradication of Catholic influence and threatening divine wrath upon anyone who showed mercy to offenders. His cruelty extended beyond matters of faith. Edward displayed a vindictive nature that startled even courtiers accustomed to the ruthlessness of his father. When displeased by servants, he devised elaborate punishments aimed more at humiliation than correction. In one instance, a page who spilled wine on the king's papers was made to stand in the courtyard for hours while courtiers hurled rotten food at him, all under the explicit direction of the 11-year-old monarch. Edward observed these humiliations with evident satisfaction, often jotting down notes on the victims' reactions as though conducting a clinical experiment. The boy king's journal entries from this time reveal a mind growing increasingly detached from normal human feeling. He described the suffering of others with the same cool precision he used when recording the weather, noting details of pain and fear as intriguing observations rather than human tragedies. When a kitchen maid died after being flogged on his orders for allegedly reciting Catholic prayers, his sole recorded remark was that the correction had been more effective than expected in preventing further error. His treatment of his own family perhaps best illustrates his escalating sociopathy. Although raised alongside his sisters in early childhood, Edward displayed no natural warmth toward Mary or Elizabeth after ascending the throne. Instead, he evaluated them through the same rigid religious lens he applied to all subjects. Mary was a dangerous Catholic to be controlled or destroyed, while Elizabeth was a potential ally, whose Protestant leanings made her only slightly more acceptable. For Edward, family relationships were never personal bonds, they were calculated political considerations to be manipulated in service of his ideological goals. The change in Edward's character became even clearer when his uncle, Thomas Seymour, tried to win influence through gifts and flattery. Rather than being softened by kindness, Edward interpreted Seymour's gestures as manipulative schemes and answered them with cold calculation. When Thomas was arrested on charges of treason, the young king not only endorsed his execution, but is said to have watched from a palace window as the man who had once shown him favor was led to the scaffold. Witnesses noted that Edward displayed no emotion as the axe descended, instead recording in his journal observations on the effectiveness of various execution techniques. By the time he reached his 12th year, his authoritarian streak had intensified dramatically. The boy, once perceived as frail and scholarly, began to take direct command of government policy, frequently overruling advisors he deemed too soft. His Protestant reforms grew harsher, with compulsory church attendance enforced by a web of informants and severe punishments for any deviation from approved doctrine. Edward personally created a system of religious surveillance that could rival the Spanish Inquisition, encouraging neighbors to denounce each other and even rewarding children for reporting the religious offenses of their own parents. The king's fixation with control reached into every corner of England's religious life. Edward issued meticulous decrees dictating not only the forms of public worship but also private devotions, prescribing precisely how his subjects should pray, what beliefs they must hold, and even how they should conceive of God. Any breach of these commands was considered treason against both crown and deity, carrying penalties that could escalate from public shaming to imprisonment, and ultimately to execution. The boy king personally examined every case, frequently heightening the prescribed punishments when he judged the original sentences insufficiently zealous in defending Protestant purity. Edward created what amounted to a network of thought police, urging citizens to inform on the religious activities of their neighbors, with incentives for successful accusations. He reportedly took great satisfaction in reading these denunciations, often summoning informants to court to elicit further details about the alleged offenses. Those convicted of harboring Catholic sympathies faced prison, torture, or execution, with Edward himself frequently revisiting their sentences to ensure the severity matched his own uncompromising vision of faith and authority. Edward's court became an arena where paranoia and fanaticism were rewarded, and any display of mercy was deemed weakness. The machinery of persecution he constructed was notable for both its systematic design and his direct oversight. Unlike many adult rulers who might delegate such grim duties, Edward personally reviewed every case, examining in detail the accusations against each suspect and often devising punishments tailored to what he considered their specific theological faults. His journals from this era read like handbooks of religious repression, containing detailed analyses of which penalties proved most effective for various forms of heresy. What made his approach especially chilling was the fusion of youthful inventiveness with deadly seriousness. Whenever conventional sentences seemed inadequate, the teenage monarch would devise fresh forms of humiliation and torment, invariably defended with elaborate theological reasoning. In one instance, a Catholic priest who refused to abandon his faith was forced to march through London carrying a placard declaring enemy of Christ while children pelted him with stones, all under Edward's explicit orders. The king observed the scene from a palace window, reportedly laughing at the priest's misery as he dictated notes on the episode to his secretary. Edward's fixation on religious purity reached into his own family, exposing his total absence of natural affection. He regarded his half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, not as kin but as the gravest threat to his Protestant England. In surviving private letters, Edward wrote of her with hatred that was at once petty and chilling, calling her the bastard and Christ's enemy, while plotting ways to have her branded illegitimate or even executed for heresy. The boy who might have felt fraternal affection instead nursed fantasies of watching his sister burn for her faith. His animosity toward Mary went far beyond political strategy, consuming him with a personal venom that alarmed even his most fervent advisors. Edward devoted hours to devising scenarios by which he could lawfully remove her from the succession, consulting Protestant lawyers eager to provide legal reasoning for what was essentially fratricide. Court observers noted that his demeanor would sour at the mere mention of Mary's name, after which he often withdrew to his chambers to compose lengthy writings on the theological necessity of erasing her claim to the throne. Edward's schemes for dealing with Mary grew steadily more intricate and cruel. He composed detailed blueprints for her arrest, trial, and execution, complete with formal charges of heresy and treason. He even drafted what he intended as Mary's confession, compelling her to renounce Catholicism and admit her illegitimacy before being granted the mercy of a swift beheading rather than the flames. These writings, preserved in the royal archives, expose a mind that had progressed far beyond political rivalry into outright sociopathic malice. His approach toward Elizabeth was more nuanced yet no less unsettling. While approving of her Protestant faith, he regarded his younger sister chiefly as a strategic asset for his religious program, not as family. Edward intended to leverage Elizabeth's eventual marriage to secure Protestant alliances, viewing her personal happiness as insignificant beside the political advantages such a union could yield. Even his comparatively favorable opinion of Elizabeth was filtered through the lens of his religious fervor, underscoring that her worth to him was entirely instrumental, a means to advance his vision of a rigorously Protestant realm, rather than a sister to be loved or protected. The king's inability to sustain genuine familial bonds extended into his wider court. Edward regarded his nobles, advisors and servants not as individuals with inherent value, but as chess pieces to be moved according to his religious and political designs. Years of loyal service could be erased in an instant if someone failed to show sufficient zeal for his ever more extreme policies. For Edward, loyalty meant unconditional submission to his vision of a Protestant England, leaving no space for personal conscience or moral hesitation. When, in early 1553, he began to exhibit serious signs of illness, his conduct became even more erratic and severe. Instead of softening in the shadow of mortality, the 15-year-old monarch became consumed with the need to guarantee that his Protestant reforms would endure beyond his life. He understood that Mary's succession would restore Catholicism, and this realization drove him toward increasingly desperate measures.
The thought of his life's work being undone by his Catholic sister filled Edward with a fury bordering on madness, prompting him to consider solutions so extreme they would have appalled even his notoriously tyrannical father. The young king's deteriorating health appeared to fuel, rather than temper, his extremism. As Edward's body weakened, his religious zeal flared with renewed intensity, as though he sought to compress a lifetime's worth of Protestant purification into his final months. Court physicians recorded that his illness was punctuated by bouts of fevered preaching, during which he delivered rambling sermons on the necessity of eradicating Catholic influence, even if that meant the slaughter of every Catholic in England. At first such tirades were dismissed as the ravings of delirium, but in his lucid intervals, Edward made it clear these sentiments were sincere convictions, not fever-induced fantasies. He began holding secret councils with radical Protestant figures, conspiring to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant cousin Lady Jane Grey. The plot that emerged was staggering in its boldness and cruelty, envisioning the arrest or assassination of both sisters and the establishment of a puppet monarchy wholly controlled by Protestant hardliners.
The 15-year-old king, despite his physical weakness, threw himself into these planning sessions, with an energy that amazed and frightened his co-conspirators. The details of Edward's final plot revealed the full extent of his transformation from innocent child to would-be tyrant, working with John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. Edward crafted a plan that would have resulted in the deaths of both his sisters and the installation of a Protestant regime, more extreme than anything England had ever seen. The conspiracy included provisions for mass executions of Catholic nobles, the seizure of all Catholic properties, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force that would monitor every aspect of English life. Edward's personal involvement in planning these atrocities was both detailed and enthusiastic. The dying king spent his final weeks drafting lists of Catholics to be executed, properties to be seized, and laws to be enacted in his Protestant paradise. His handwriting, increasingly shaky due to his illness, filled page after page with plans for what amounted to religious genocide. The 15-year-old king, though frail in body, hurled himself into these planning sessions with a vigor that astonished and unnerved his co-conspirators. The specifics of Edward's last scheme laid bare the complete arc of his transformation, from seemingly innocent boy to aspiring despot. In collaboration with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, he devised a plan that would have ended with the deaths of both sisters, and the creation of a Protestant regime harsher than anything England had yet endured. The plot called for the mass execution of Catholic nobles, the wholesale confiscation of Catholic estates, and the founding of a permanent religious police force, tasked with overseeing every facet of English life. Edward's personal role in designing these brutal measures was both meticulous and fervent. In his final weeks, the dying monarch compiled extensive lists of Catholics marked for execution, properties slated for seizure, and laws intended to cement his Protestant utopia. His handwriting, increasingly unsteady from illness, filled page after page with what was, in effect, a blueprint for religious genocide. Edward's illness carried a cruel irony, almost resembling divine retribution for the atrocities he had planned. Modern medical evaluations indicate that the young king likely suffered from a combination of tuberculosis and arsenic poisoning, the latter perhaps unintentionally administered by his own doctors in a misguided attempt to cure him. The paradox was not lost on contemporaries. The monarch who had poisoned England with religious hatred was himself being slowly poisoned by those striving to preserve his life. As the toxins and disease ravaged his body, Edward endured hallucinations and bouts of delirium, which his courtiers often interpreted as religious visions. The boy who had shown no compassion to others spent his final weeks in unrelenting agony, his body racked with pain as he gradually wasted away. Court physicians remarked that his suffering appeared to fuel his religious zeal, rather than offer him any spiritual solace, as though his physical torment served only to feed his obsessive fervor instead of cleansing it. The circumstances of Edward's death were especially harrowing for those present. Court physicians noted that, weeks before his passing, the young king's body began to emit a foul stench, and his skin developed a greenish hue indicative of severe poisoning. His hair and fingernails fell out, and he was racked by violent convulsions that sometimes left him temporarily paralyzed. Once regarded as one of Henry VIII's most handsome children, he became a grotesque shadow of his former self, his body appearing to rebel against the poison destroying it. Most disturbing of all, Edward retained enough clarity of mind to comprehend his condition. In his final days, he alternated between screams of physical torment and frenzied tirades about Protestant martyrs. His last coherent words were not of reconciliation or forgiveness, but of deep regret that he would not live to complete his envisioned purification of England.
The dying monarch implored his co-conspirators to carry on with their scheme even in his absence, assuring them that God would reward their devotion in bringing his Protestant paradise into being. The boy king's final hours formed a grotesque distortion of a deathbed scene. Rather than seeking forgiveness or offering affection to his family, Edward used his last breath to curse his Catholic sister and pray for God's protection over Protestant England against what he termed Mary's wickedness. Witnesses attested that his final utterances were not of peace but of unvarnished hatred, a fitting conclusion to a life consumed by religious zealotry and political extremism. When Edward died on July 6, 1553, the sense of relief among his courtiers was unmistakable, though few dared voice it openly. The monarch who had once been hailed as England's salvation had become its waking nightmare, and his passing provided the only release from the relentlessly radical policies steering the kingdom towards civil war. Even his most loyal adherents privately conceded that his death might have been a mercy for England, though they would never have dared to acknowledge such sentiments in public. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death exposed just how dependent his meticulously crafted schemes had been on his personal authority. Without the king's relentless will driving it, the conspiracy unraveled within mere days. As moderate Protestants abandoned what they now recognized as an extremist venture, Lady Jane Grey, the intended figurehead of Edward's coup, found herself nearly without allies as nobles who had appeared steadfast in their Protestant allegiance abruptly found pressing matters elsewhere. Mary's triumphant claim to the throne drew support not only from Catholics but also from moderate Protestants, alarmed by the depths of fanaticism Edward's rule had revealed. The boy monarch who had envisioned himself as England's greatest Protestant champion had instead guaranteed that his reign would be remembered chiefly for its cruelty and for the collective relief that followed his passing. Even staunch Protestants found themselves embracing Catholic Mary as a safer alternative to the relentless governance of Protestant extremists. The irony of Edward's legacy stretches far beyond the collapse of his succession scheme. The young king, so fixated on eradicating Catholic influence, ultimately reinforced it through his extremism. By persecuting moderate voices within the Protestant movement, he left English Protestantism dominated by zealots whose severity alienated ordinary believers instead of drawing them in. By the time of his death, many Protestants in England had begun to see Catholicism as a refuge from the increasingly oppressive demands of Edward's brand of reformed religion. Modern historians have re-examined Edward VI's reign, and the portrait that emerges is far darker than the traditional image of a frail boy controlled by ambitious counselors. Surviving court records and private correspondence reveal a youth genuinely eager to persecute, displaying troubling signs of taking pleasure in the suffering of others. Edward's direct role in plotting executions, along with his meticulous journals cataloguing torture techniques, suggests that for 6 years England had been ruled by what can only be described as a child psychopath endowed with absolute power. Edward's journey from innocent child to ruthless tyrant offers grim insight into the corrupting force of absolute authority. Unlike adult monarchs who might preserve some capacity for empathy or pragmatic judgment, his complete isolation from normal human interaction, paired with an unshakable belief in his divine mandate, produced a perfect storm of cruelty. The boy who had never once been denied, and who believed resistance to his will was quite literally sinful, became capable of atrocities that shocked even the brutal Tudor era. Contemporary reports suggest that Edward's courtiers grew increasingly alarmed by their young sovereign's conduct, yet felt powerless to intervene. The very doctrine of divine right that legitimized his reign also rendered any challenge to his wishes equivalent to blasphemy, leaving even his closest advisors unable to temper his escalating severity. Edward fashioned a court where his lightest whim assumed the weight of law, and his burgeoning appetite for cruelty faced no restraint other than death itself. Perhaps most unsettling is the question of what might have transpired had Edward survived into full adulthood. His vision for Protestant England encompassed the creation of a permanent religious police force, the total eradication of Catholic nobility, and the establishment of a surveillance state overseeing every detail of his subjects' private lives. By the time of his death in 1553, the teenage king had already begun to implement these measures on a limited scale, and there is every reason to believe that an adult Edward VI would have forged one of history's most repressive regimes. His legacy stands as a stark reminder that evil can arise from the most unexpected origins, and that even ostensibly noble intentions can be perverted by unchecked authority and religious zeal. The boy monarch who imagined himself the savior of England's soul came dangerously close to destroying its body, and his death may have been the greatest mercy his reign could have granted his people. His life stands as a stark warning about the perils of uniting absolute authority with rigid ideological conviction, particularly in the hands of someone too young to grasp the full weight of their actions. Edward's tale also highlights the dangerous intersection of youth, power, and dogma. While adult despots might be tempered by political pragmatism or personal bonds, his complete isolation and unwavering belief in his own moral infallibility enabled him to envision atrocities that even seasoned power brokers found appalling. The child who should have been playing with toys was instead devising mass executions and sweeping religious purges, treating human lives as expendable tools in his mission for doctrinal purity. His reign further illustrates how education can devolve into indoctrination when stripped of balance and compassion. Edward's tutors had fashioned a brilliant theological thinker, but also a moral void. A boy capable of crafting elaborate intellectual defenses for cruelty, yet wholly ignorant of basic human empathy. His story remains a cautionary reminder of the inherent danger in any educational system that elevates ideological purity above fundamental decency. Ultimately, Edward's reign compels us to face disquieting truths about both history and human nature. It disrupts the comforting assumption that cruelty always stems from corrupt counselors or outside forces, insisting instead that sometimes the capacity for evil originates within the ruler, even when that ruler is a child. His life also prompts us to consider how societies mold their leaders, and the dangers inherent in constructing systems that concentrate excessive power in a single figure. The England over which Edward presided was one where religion and politics were inseparable, where dissent equated to treason and mercy signaled weakness. The young king mastered this environment with alarming skill, manipulating its rules to refashion it according to his own will. The tragedy of Edward's reign lies not merely in his early death, but in the fact that he lived long enough to cause enduring damage.